You need to not go too cheap or there'll just be problems. And then that's when the students will get disgusted. So you'll end up with an instrument in the closet or hanging on the wall rather than being played because they just get frustrated. There's enough frustration to play the violin. It's one of the hardest instruments to learn to play. Well, at least.
Where do you get your wood? Not around here.
No, there are violin houses that sell all the different parts for instruments that you can go to. There are specialist wood dealers for violins. I have gone to Sitka, Alaska to get some of my wood. The European wood I bought locally, or United States locally from dealers. But as I said before, it has to be specially treated. It has to be wood that's specially, certain. There are even some people that say, "Oh, it's got to come from the south side of the mountain." I don't know about that.
No.
But the tonal characteristics of the wood are very important.
You have to trust them.
Yes, you have to trust them. And many of these wood dealers have been around for over 100 years. So, not the ones in Alaska because that's a newer business. So, probably before the 50s or 60s, we didn't use anything but European wood in the United States, except for maybe self-taught makers in West Virginia. They went out and cut down a tree and said, "Okay, I'm going to make a little paw." Sorry. Anyway.
Do you sign your name?
Yes, all my instruments are labeled with my name.
Where do you put your
Where do I put it? All instruments have a label that is placed inside the instrument when you're finished. It's placed in this F-hole and glued to the back of the instrument. It's just a paper label. Unfortunately, because of the greatness of Strad and Guarneri and all the others and so many other makers that we haven't discussed, there's been a whole lot of forgery. When you're talking about millions of dollars at stake, there's been a lot of forgery. There's also been a lot of, I guess what I like to call homage paid to those great makers. There were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of factories, and I say factories with quotes because they were all handmade instruments in the 1870s, 1920s, and 30s that had just thousands of makers working for them, pumping out instruments. And I mean maybe 5 million instruments over that time period that were today are worth anywhere from next to nothing up to $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. They were all intended for mostly for students, but for more advanced players. But a lot of them have labels: Stradivarius, Amati, Guarneri, Ruggieri, Guadagnini. Mostly Italian names, but some German names like Klotz and Steiner and French makers too. These factories were in France, Germany, and Czechoslovakia, and every day I get questions on the internet from people, which I'm on a couple of different bulletin boards, asking, is my instrument genuine? And I say, well, probably not, but there's a lot of clues, and but they serve their purpose. But Stradivari made about 1,200 instruments, of which about 650 are still around today. So,
Do you play?
I do play the violin, yes. I started off as a player, and then...
Did you bring your bow with you?
I do have a bow. I do have to tell you, though, that this violin here is not one of mine. I don't actually own one of my own instruments. My very, very first instrument I gave to my mother. After I played on it for a number of years, but then I gave it to her. Ever since then, I had a shop. I had hundreds of violins. I could go in my violin room and grab a violin anytime I wanted a violin. If I had a concert, I'd grab a violin, get used to it, and then use that one. But I don't own a violin anymore. But I'm rectifying that. The violin that you see up here, or when you come up, is one I'm making for me. So the viola is going to be sold, but the violin is going to be for me, even if I don't end up playing anymore. But it still will be for me. So.
What happens when you make a mistake? Maybe can you rectify?
Some things can be rectified without having to start over. Very few things have to be done, start over. As a restorer, I've had to make new pieces for violins, but even when I was in school and you saw that picture of me planing the ribs of the instrument to flatten them. Well, I slipped and I went too far and I whacked one of the ribs and cracked it right down the middle. So my teacher showed us how to remove the rib, and then I made a new one. So, I've put a crack in an instrument before, which I've fixed and patched. Sometimes when you're cutting into, especially the spruce, the top of the instrument, you'll find a sap pocket, a spot where there's actually a little bit of a sap in there. And that usually is cut out and a patch is put in. If you find them all the time on old instruments, you'll see these sap pockets that have been patched. It's just something that we do. You try not to make mistakes. You try to work rough and then smooth and smoother and smoother and smoother until you're down to it. So any mistakes you make are so small that it doesn't matter. Maybe you'd notice, but nobody else would.
And the glue lasts, the animal glue.
The animal hide glue lasts centuries. The center seam on the instrument, as you saw in the picture, the dimensions, the center is at anywhere from 2.5 to 4 millimeters. That's less than 1/4 of an inch. That seam on some of the Strads and even the Amatis from the 1500s is still original. So 450 years later, it's also the glue that furniture makers used for hundreds of years until they came up with all the modern things. The disadvantage of animal glues is that it takes a little longer for the glue to dry. But once it is, it's very strong. And it doesn't actually create the glues that are used today a lot are what they call white glues or yellow glues, carpenter glues. And they create a surface between the pieces of wood. That glue then can actually create a little line that you can see. And the animal glue, the way it works is it soaks into the wood and actually has kind of little hairy fingers that are what hold together. So the glue goes into this piece of wood, the glue goes into this piece of wood, and that's what you've got. You don't have a surface between the two.
It's like the gorilla glue that they have.
Yeah, but that creates a surface too. It's amazing. Gorilla glue, put a drop of water in that, and it foams. So what that means is it's telling me that it is filling gaps rather than wood to wood. And so you end up with a surface with that. I've used that, not in violin making, but in my theater work, I've used that a lot. It's great. Great stuff.
These are all made of beautiful wood and everything else. Sunday night on 60 Minutes, they had a story on
The garbage?
Yeah.
The garbage orchestra?
The garbage. How do they get the same kind of sound and that sort of thing when they don't have...
Well, you're not going to have the same quality of sound. You are going to have sound of the same pitches, of course, and you'll have a violin-like sound because it is an acoustic body and it is using a bow. So you get that kind of a sound versus a guitar sound versus a trumpet sound, which of course is because you're blowing through a piece of brass. So it's not going to be the same sound, but it is a similar family kind of a sound.
I apologize for my speakers, but what's the difference between a violin and a fiddle?
The violin and fiddle are the same monster, except for the way they are played, okay? The kind of music that are played on it, and the way they are set up. Fiddlers like a flatter bridge, that curve on the top of the bridge. They like it flatter because they do a lot of string crossings, very strong, fast string crossings. They don't play as loud, and so it makes it easier to cross from one string to the other when you don't have to raise your arm like this. So, and then they also tend to use steel strings rather than synthetic core strings, which are a warmer string, and so you get a different kind of a sound. There are fiddlers that will use any kind of a violin, and violinists even call their instruments fiddles. It's just kind of what they call them. And So it really, certain fiddlers like certain types of sound also, so they may not like a lot of violins with what we call complicated overtones. They like simpler sounds and with less overtones. And so every violin can be a violin, but not every violin can be a fiddle, if you kind of understand what I'm saying. Yes, Al?
In the vernacular, they say that the violin uses strings,
Strangs?
but the fiddle uses strings.
Yeah. Strings and strangs. Yeah. Well, thank you. Please come up and look at things if you have any questions. I'll be here all week now.